Imagine receiving a letter that contains only 2 words, no greeting, no explanation, no signature necessary, because the man who sent it commands the largest army the ancient world has ever assembled. The message is brief, brutal, and absolute. Give Earth. In the diplomatic language of the era, that means hand over your land, your city, your people, your freedom.
This is your final warning,
Surrender
Spartans.
everything,
Lay
or
down
be
your
destroyed.
shields and
Most
submit
Greek
to the great
city-states that
king,
received this
or
letter
your
from the
legacy
Persian
will
king
be
Xerxes
erased
in
from
480
history.
BC did exactly what any rational government would do when confronted with an overwhelming military superpower. They folded, they submitted, they sent their tokens of earth and water as a gesture of submission and hoped the storm would pass them by. But one city received that letter and sent back an answer so audacious, so magnificent in its defiance, that it has echoed through 2,500 years of human history. The Spartans, according to ancient accounts, replied with a single word, molon lebe. Come and take them. What happened next at a narrow mountain pass on the coast of central Greece in the scorching heat of late summer, 480 BC, was not supposed to matter. 300 soldiers defending a bottleneck against an army of hundreds of thousands was not a battle. It was a footnote, a delay, a speed bump on the road to conquest. And yet the Battle of Thermopylae became something else entirely. It became the moment a small force of soldiers, knowing they would die, chose to stand anyway, and in doing so may have saved the entire concept of Western civilization as we know it. This is the story of those 3 days that changed the world. To understand what Thermopylae meant, you have to understand what Persia was. By 480 BC, the Persian Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west to the edges of India in the east, from the Black Sea in the north to the burning sands of Egypt in the south. Under the rule of successive kings, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, and now Xerxes, Persia had absorbed kingdom after kingdom, culture after culture, swallowing nations the way a rising tide swallows a shoreline. At its height, the empire controlled roughly 44% of the world's entire population. Xerxes, who ascended to the Persian throne in 486 BC, was a king who understood the weight of his inheritance and was determined to expand it. His father Darius had sent an expedition against Greece 10 years earlier in 490 BC and had been humiliated at the Battle of Marathon, where the Athenian army, outnumbered fighting without cavalry, had somehow defeated the Persian force and sent it fleeing back to its ships. For Darius, Marathon was an unfinished wound. For Xerxes, it was a personal debt of honor that demanded repayment in blood. The preparations Xerxes made for his Greek campaign were on a scale that defied comprehension. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus, our primary source for these events, claimed the Persian army numbered 2.6 million men. Modern historians believe that figure is wildly exaggerated, but even the most conservative estimates place Xerxes' force at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers. His fleet, meanwhile, was enormous, somewhere between 600 and 1,200 warships, enough to darken the horizon when they sailed in formation. He built 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, so his army could march directly across the water. When a storm destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes reportedly ordered the sea itself to be whipped 300 times as punishment. That was the kind of man Greece was dealing with, a king who believed he could discipline the ocean. Against this, the Greek city-states presented a fractured, argumentative, deeply divided front. Greece in 480 BC was not a nation. It was a collection of hundreds of independent city-states, each with its own government, its
One
own culture,
army.
its own gods, and its own interests.
One purpose.
Athens and
We are
Sparta,
bound
the
by
two
this
most
oath.
powerful, had spent generations viewing each other with a mixture of rivalry and contempt. Getting them to agree on anything was a political achievement in itself. But the threat was real
We blocked
and
the pass at
existential,
Thermopylae.
and a coalition
fleet
of
holds the
31
straits at
city-states
Artemisium.
eventually
They
came
shall not
together
pass
under
by
the broader
land
banner
or by
of Greek
sea.
resistance. They called themselves the Hellenic League. Their combined forces were vastly smaller than what Persia could field, but they had two strategic advantages that they intended to exploit. The first was the terrain of Greece itself. The Greek peninsula is not flat farmland.
Spartans!
It is a rugged
Rock
mountainous
shields!
landscape
Advance in
bisected
unison!
by narrow passes and choke points, where the numerical advantage of a vast army becomes
Faster.
irrelevant.
Pick up the pace.
A pass wide enough for only a
Keep going.
handful of men to fight side by
Eyes forward.
side could be held indefinitely, in theory, by a small determined force because the Persians could not bring their numbers to bear. The second advantage was the Greek soldier himself, specifically the hoplite. The Greek fighting man was heavily
We must
armored,
control the
trained to
sea
fight in a
if we
tight
hope to
formation
take those
called the
mountains.
phalanx, and psychologically
fleet
conditioned
is ready.
to hold the line rather than break and run. A Spartan hoplite, in particular, was something else entirely. A professional warrior produced by a society that had organized its entire culture around the single goal of military excellence. The Greek strategy was this: hold the Persian army at a series of narrow choke points, while the Greek fleet attempted to disrupt Persian naval supply lines. The land army would buy time. The navy would make the price of invasion unsustainable. It was a dangerous plan that required everything to work simultaneously. For the first great choke point, the Greeks chose a place called Thermopylae. The name means hot gates, named for the sulfurous hot springs that bubble up from the earth nearby. A geological curiosity that ancient Greeks associated with the underworld. In 480 BC, Thermopylae was a narrow coastal pass where the mountains plunged almost directly into the sea. At its narrowest point, the pass was only about 15 meters wide, just enough room for a cart to pass, according to some ancient descriptions.
Move forward.
Cliffs rose on one side, and the sea lapped at the other.
Close ranks.
It was in military
Maintain
terms
formation.
a perfect cork in a bottle. The force assigned to hold it was commanded by Leonidas, the king of Sparta. He was in his 60s, a man who had survived the brutal
scouts
Spartan
back yet?
agauge, the training
Not since
regimen
dawn.
that took boys from their
Patrols
families at
reported
age
movement
7
near the river.
and forged them into
attack at
soldiers
first light,
over the next
regardless.
13 years through a process
hold
of
them
organized
here,
hardship,
at the hot
violence,
gates.
and
The narrow
unrelenting
pass
competition.
negates their cavalry.
Leonidas had earned
What
his
if they
throne
flank
not
us
merely
by
by
sea?
birth, but by surviving everything Sparta had thrown at him. His personal guard consisted of 300 men, the Ephialtes, the elite royal bodyguard of Sparta. Each man had been specifically chosen for this assignment. Each man already had a son, so that his family name would continue. They were not expected to come home. Leonidas knew what he was bringing them to. Alongside the Spartans came contingents from other Greek cities. Roughly 700 fighters from the city of Thespians, 400 from Thebes. The latter joined somewhat reluctantly and would later be the subject of bitter controversy, and several thousand more from Corinth, Arcadia Phocis, and other states. Total Greek forces at Thermopylae numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men, depending on which ancient source you read. The exact number matters less than what they were standing against. It was late summer when the Persian army arrived August by modern reckoning. Xerxes sent a scout ahead to observe the Greek position before committing to battle. The scout returned with a report that confused the Persian king. The Greeks were calm. They were exercising. Some of them were combing their long hair. They seemed almost to be preparing for a festival, not a battle. Xerxes summoned Demaratus, a former Spartan king who was living in exile at the Persian court, and asked him what this behavior meant. Demaratus had tried to warn Xerxes before the campaign that the Spartans would not submit. Now he explained the Spartans always combed their hair before a battle in which they expected to die. They were not afraid. They were simply preparing to meet their end with the dignity their culture demanded. Xerxes reportedly laughed. He sent an emissary to the Greek position offering terms, lay down your weapons and you will be spared. Go home and you may live as honored subjects of the Persian crown. The Greek response attributed to Leonidas was the two words already famous in antiquity, molon labe. Come and take them. Xerxes waited 4 days before attacking. The ancient sources suggest he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing, a few thousand men refusing to retreat, and expected them to come to their senses. When they didn't, he sent in his first wave of troops. They broke. The Medes, the elite warriors of the Persian army, charged the Greek position and found themselves in a tactical nightmare. The narrow pass meant they could not spread out and use their numbers. The Greek phalanx shields, locked together, 8-foot spears bristling outward, was essentially a moving wall. Every time the Persians pressed forward, they ran into that wall of bronze and iron, and men died. Every time they tried to pull back, the Spartans pursued them, engaging in a tactic described by Herodotus with grudging admiration. The Spartans would feign retreat, drawing the Persians forward into a disordered charge, then turn and destroy them. By the end of the first day, Xerxes had lost thousands of men to a force he outnumbered perhaps 100 to 1. He reportedly tore his robe in frustration and sent in his most elite troops, the Immortals, his personal 10,000-man guard, supposedly the finest soldiers in the empire. The Immortals hit the same wall. What made the Spartans so effective wasn't mystical warrior spirit, it was training and tactics. A Spartan soldier had been preparing for exactly this kind of brutal close-quarters fighting for his entire adult life. His shield arm was as strong and disciplined as a machine. His spear work was as automatic as breathing. When the man next to him fell, he closed the gap without thinking. The phalanx didn't break because each individual piece of it had been conditioned not to break. The Persians, for all their numbers, were attacking a mechanism, not just men. The second day was much the same. The Persians threw wave after wave against the pass and got the same result: enormous casualties, no progress. The Greek losses were real, but manageable Spartan losses in particular appear to have been relatively light. The pass was working exactly as planned. Then came the third day, and everything changed. Somewhere in the Greek encampment, there was a man named Ephialtes. He was a local, a native of the Malian region near Thermopylae. He knew the mountains. He knew a secret. There was another path.
Shields up!
High above the main pass, winding through the mountains, was a track called the Anapaia. It was rough-going, steep, difficult, suitable only for goats and men willing to work hard for several hours. But it existed, and it led to a position directly behind the Greek line. Ephialtes went to Xerxes and offered to show the Persians the path. In exchange, he asked for rewards. Xerxes agreed immediately. That night, the Immortals began climbing. A contingent of Greek soldiers, 1,000 Phocian fighters, had been posted to guard the Anapaia path. But in the darkness and chaos of the Persian approach, they made a fatal error, hearing the sounds of the advancing enemy. They retreated to higher ground to defend themselves, leaving the path open. The Immortals came through at dawn. Greek scouts brought the news to Leonidas at first light. He had perhaps a few hours before his entire force was encircled and destroyed. He gathered his commanders and made a decision that has been analyzed debated and admired ever since. He dismissed the majority of the Greek allies, ordering them to withdraw south and live to fight another day. Their deaths here would accomplish nothing. They were needed elsewhere. The 300 Spartans stayed. Along with them remained approximately 700 Thespians. Their commander Demophilus refused to retreat, and the 400 Thebans who had little choice. There are ancient accounts of Leonidas speaking to his men that morning, though no one can know what he actually said. Some ancient writers have him simply telling the Spartans to eat a good breakfast because that night they would dine in Hades. What is certain is that Leonidas led his men forward out from the defensive position at the pass into the open ground to fight one last battle. He was not trying to hold the pass anymore. He was buying time for the Greek allies to escape. He was covering the retreat of an army. And perhaps he was doing something else too, giving the Greek world a story it would not forget. The final battle was brief and savage. The Spartans and Thespians fought with their spears until the shafts broke, then with their swords, and when the swords were gone, with their hands and teeth, according to Herodotus. Leonidas was killed early in the fighting. His men rallied around his body to prevent the Persians from taking it a sign of the personal loyalty that bound Spartan units together. They pulled back to a small hill and made their final stand there. The Persians, furious after 2 days of humiliation, eventually overwhelmed them by sheer weight of numbers, firing volley after volley of arrows until the last defenders fell. When it was over, Xerxes ordered Leonidas's body beheaded and crucified, an act of desecration deeply unusual for the Persian king, who generally treated defeated enemies with respect. That he went out of his way to dishonor Leonidas's corpse tells you something about how much those 3 days had cost him. Around 298 Spartans died at Thermopylae. All 700 Thespians died. The Thebans, it is recorded, surrendered. The Spartans who fell were buried where they lay, and a memorial was erected over their grave, an inscription composed by the lyric poet Simonides, 4 lines that became perhaps the most famous epitaph in the ancient world. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. In the short term, Thermopylae was a Persian victory. The pass was open. Xerxes marched south. He took Athens evacuated of most of its citizens and burned the Acropolis. It seemed from a Persian perspective that the campaign was essentially won, but something had happened at Thermopylae that couldn't be measured in territory or body counts. The Greek world had seen clearly, undeniably, that Persian forces could be stopped. That with the right men in the right terrain, the empire's numbers meant nothing. The psychological impact was enormous. Greek city-states that had been wavering in their allegiance began to stiffen. The Hellenic League held together. 1 month after Thermopylae, the Greek navy under Athenian commander Themistocles maneuvered the Persian fleet into the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Athenian mainland. In the confines of the strait, Persian numerical advantage evaporated just as it had at Thermopylae. The Greeks destroyed roughly 200 Persian ships, shattered Xerxes' ability to supply and support his army, and forced the Persian king to retreat back to Asia. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, in 479 BC, a Greek land force decisively defeated the remaining Persian army on Greek soil. The invasion was over. Greece survived. And the values that Greece would transmit to Western civilization, democratic governance, philosophical inquiry, individual rights, before the law, the idea that citizens should have a voice in their own government survived with it. Would any of that have happened without the stand at Thermopylae? It's impossible to know with certainty. But what we can say is this: Thermopylae bought the time the Greek fleet needed to regroup. It demonstrated a tactical template-used terrain to neutralize Persian numbers that would be repeated at Salamis and Plataea. It gave the Greek resistance movement a story that made retreat feel like cowardice and resistance feel like duty. There is a tendency when we tell the story of Thermopylae to present it as a simple tale of brave men against impossible odds, to reduce it to the aesthetics of heroism without asking harder questions. But history honestly examined is never that clean. The Spartan society that produced Leonidas in his 300 was also a society built on slavery. The Helots, and enslaved people who vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens, farmed the land, provided the wealth, and freed the Spartans from any work other than war. Without the Helots, there are no Spartans. There is no Agoge, no professional warrior class, no 300. The freedom that Sparta defended at Thermopylae was not a freedom that extended to the people who made Sparta possible. The Thespians who died alongside the Spartans, all 700 of them, every single one, are rarely mentioned in the films and the popular retellings. Their city Thespiae was subsequently destroyed by the Persians in retaliation. They had refused to submit, and they paid a price at least as heavy as Sparta's, with far less celebration in the history books. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. And Ephialtes, the man who showed Persians the mountain path, was condemned and hunted by the Greeks afterward. His name became in Greek a word for nightmare. But he was a local man of no special importance, acting under the pressures and incentives that shape all human choices. History tends to flatten such people into simple villains. The reality, as always, is more complicated. These are the shadows in the story. They don't diminish what happened at Thermopylae, they deepen it. The ancient world did not forget. Greek sculptors celebrated the battle in marble. Greek playwrights referenced it. The poet Simonides wrote not just the famous epitaph, but other verses honoring the fallen. For Greeks living in the century after 480 BC, Thermopylae was not ancient history. It was living memory, the moment their world had nearly ended and had not. The Romans absorbed the story and made it their own model of virtuous sacrifice. Renaissance scholars rediscovered it. The Enlightenment used it as a reference point for debates about freedom versus tyranny. Modern armies teach it as a case study in the strategic value of tactical delay. And in our own time, in the films, we make the metaphors, we reach for the shorthand we use when we want to describe standing against impossible odds. Thermopylae is still there. This is where we hold. We fight here. The language of the last stand draws its grammar from the Western tradition, from a 15-meter wide mountain pass in ancient Greece. There is something in that story that speaks to a deeply human anxiety. What do you do when you know you cannot win? When the forces arrayed against you are too large, too powerful, too inevitable? Most people, most of the time, make the rational choice. They adapt, they accommodate, they find a way to survive. But occasionally, not often, not reliably, not predictably, someone makes a different calculation, not a suicidal one, not a hopeless one, a strategic one. They understand that a defeat in the right place at the right time in the right manner can be worth more than a tactical victory somewhere else. They understand that the story of how you fight matters sometimes as much as whether you win. Leonidas knew that Persia would take the pass. He knew his men would die. What he may also have known or sensed or hoped was that the manner of their dying would not be forgotten, that it would travel south through the mountains,
Spartans
faster than the
held the
Persian
line.
army, reach
They
Athens
showed
and
us the
Corinth
true
and Sparta,
meaning of sacrifice.
and say to every Greek heart,
Now,
resistance is
we
possible.
Fight here,
Resistance
where their numbers
is
count
worth
for
it.
nothing.
They
This
stood,
strait will be
they
their
held.
undoing.
they chose. 2,500 years later, we still talk about those 3 days in August of 480 BC. We still carve the words of Simonides into monuments.
Move out.
We still invoke the number 300 as a symbol of defiant courage. We still visit the past smaller now, with the sea receded back from the ancient shoreline, the geography altered by centuries of sedimentation, and stand where Leonidas stood and try to feel the weight of what happened there. History rarely offers us simple lessons, but sometimes it offers us stories so distilled in their drama, so transparent in their stakes, so utterly uncompromising in their demand that we consider what we would do in those final hours before the Persians came through the mountains, that they become something more than history. They become a mirror. The Spartans at Thermopylae looked into that mirror. They saw men who had chosen fully and deliberately to stand on a piece of ground and say no further. Not because it was strategically certain,
Look here.
not because they had a plan for survival,
This changes
Because it was
everything
right.
we thought we knew
Because it was
about
necessary.
the siege of Byzantium.
because someone had to.
cannot
The
yield
story
to
of
this
Thermopylae
oppression.
does
The
not
spirit
end
of
at the
Thermopylae
pass.
demands
It ends in
action.
every
Yes,
subsequent
but
moment in
tempered with
history
reason, else we
where a
become
small
the
force
tyrants
held a line
ourselves.
it could not logically hold
This narrow
and
pass
bought
was
enough time
ideal
for the
a
world to
tactical
change.
delay, forcing the Persians into
Go
a
tell
choke
the
point.
Spartans,
What
stranger
about
passing
the
by,
Anapia path?
that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. If this story moved you, if you feel that familiar pull of history speaking across 25 centuries, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week we uncover the battles, the decisions, and the moments that shaped our world. The stories that textbooks reduce to footnotes and that deserve to be remembered in full. The next chapter is already waiting. See you there.